This is the Quadmula Djinn F25 that I built last year, and although I haven't made a huge song and dance about it, you'll have seen it in videos like this one with Natasha, who I took for a ride along. But today I'm not going to show you how I built this Djinn F25 with DJI O3, I'm going to show you how I built this, which is the Djinn F25 SP. This is my first build with the DJI O4 Pro. It is sub 250 and is probably one of the easiest builds I've done so far. So let's take a look at this in a little bit more detail before we get into the build. This frame is one of the first freestyle frames built specifically for the O4 Pro camera with its massively wide field of view. It's a 2.5 inch build, and although it's a squashed X style frame, just like the previous F25, it has no props in view when you're filming. And because it takes the full-size chonker of a camera, the DJI O4, that means that if you're a freestyle pilot, you could probably use this to try out some cinematic as well. And if this flies anywhere near as well as my O3 Djinn F25, I know that I'm going to love it, and I know that you will too. So just like the video I did last year of the Quadmula Siren F35, I'm going to show you the full build. I'm going to take you through all of the parts and tools that you need. We're going to put this thing together, and then we're going to go and set it up. And we're going to go through this step by step in the video so you can follow along. This is going to be a long video. However, I'm going to leave timestamps below so you can jump to the section that you need, or you can come back later and pick up where you left off. Before I start, I want to thank Quadmula for sending me one of these frames ahead of the launch. I've been building, flying and enjoying Quadmula frames for the last 2 years. All of these Quadmula frames I have behind me, I bought with my own money, so I really appreciate them offering to send me one for free. I'm not one of their sponsored pilots, I'm so not good enough to be one. I will leave a link to some of their pilots down below in the description so you can see just what these frames are capable of in the hands of a pro. Quadmula asked me if I wanted to check out the frame before it was launched. They haven't asked me to do a video on this, they haven't asked me to say anything about the frame. In fact, they didn't actually give me any info about the frame other than it was an F25 and it was made specifically for the O4. But that's enough of me talking, let's grab some coffee, get some music on and get straight into the build.
So let's take you through some of the tools that you're going to need. You're going to need a 2mm hex driver like this one. You're also going to need a 1.5mm hex driver like this one, which is electric, but you don't need an electric one. You can just get any hex driver. You'll need a soldering iron. This is the one that I use, which is the TS80. It's USB-C. You can run it off a power bank. It's kind of a travel one, and I'm using it with this chisel tip at the moment. But you know, you can use any soldering iron. You don't have to use this one. But also, I like to use this other tip as well, which is a kind of smaller tip to get to those hard to reach areas, and that can be kind of swapped out on the TS80 pretty quickly. You need a pair of tweezers, and I like these ones, but any tweezers will do. You'll need a pair of snips as well, just for chopping some of those wires down and stripping them. You're going to need some solder. I like to use this TBS solder as it comes with flux already in it. It's really good, it lasts ages, but you can use any solder you like. And then just for sticking the motor wires down, I like to use this kind of fabric type tape. You can use electrical tape if you want as well. I also have this pack of heat shrink tubes, which is really good for either repairing wires or isolating things like the capacitor, for instance, which we'll need a little bit later on. You'll need a USB-C so that you can set up the flight controller also when we come to that a little bit later. You need some flux. Now I use this no clean flux pen. You can just use normal flux, but I prefer this one because you don't have to clean it off afterwards, and it's really easy to put onto all of the soldering joints. And highly recommended, I would get you don't have to get this one, but I would also get a multimeter so that you can check the continuity later on, just to make sure there are no shorts. But you can see here, once there is continuity in that circuit, it starts to kind of beep and flash at you. Not necessary, but I would recommend getting one. Also not necessary, but I would recommend getting one, is a heat gun like this one for shrink wrapping things. You can do it with a match or a lighter, but I prefer to use one of these, it's a bit more accurate. And a smoke stopper, which this one is from TBS. VFly do one as well, which is pretty good, but I like to use this to do the final checks before plugging in the battery for real. Let's go through the parts that you're going to need for this build, and for this build I'm using the Quadmula Djinn F25 SP. This is built specifically for the O4 Pro. This comes with everything in the pack, which is why I like to use Quadmula frames. You don't have to get anything extra. I'm going to be using this Flywoo Goku F22 Pro 20x20 mini stack, which is something I've never used before. I normally use a T-motor stack, but couldn't get one locally, so I'm going to be using this one. It looks pretty cool. It has connectors for everything. Seems like a pretty good spec as well, and the price is pretty good too. I'm going to pair this with these RCInPower 1404 motors. These are the GTS V3 version at 3850 kV. I normally use T-motor motors as well, but I couldn't get those for this build, so this is what I could source locally. Apparently these are pretty good. They come in this really cool red color as well, and they feel pretty solid, so I'm interested to see how these fly like as well. As the frame is designed specifically to work with the O4 Air Unit Pro, and this is the one that people are going to have trouble fitting, I decided to use this. I was originally going to use the light version, but the camera cable isn't quite long enough to fit from the back of the frame to the front. So for this build, I'm going to use the O4 Air Unit Pro. I've never tried this before. It took a little while to get here, so I'm excited to see what it's like. For the receiver, I normally use Crossfire, but for this build I'm going to be using ELRS. This is the Radiomaster RP01. You can use any ELRS receiver. I find this one very reliable, so I tend to use these in my builds, and they're still pretty small, pretty lightweight, really good for sub 250 builds too. And it's always good to have a couple of cable ties. In this build I'm going to use 2 cable ties, but I would always have a spare anyway, just in case, because you never know if you make a mistake and then have to cut it off and then replace it. So now that you've got all the parts and tools that you need, let's get this put together. We're going to start with the frame. So with the magic of YouTube, I am going to open this. And as always with Quadmula frames, they come with everything. This is the O4 antenna mount because there's 2 of them. And you can see some of the other O4 bits here, like the camera mount, which is kind of interesting design. We'll get onto that a little bit later on. And then they even supply a capacitor with a capacitor mount in there. But as you can see here, everything is labeled very, very clearly, so you know which parts to use for what exactly. And they even give you a bunch of spares in case you lose something in the process, which is a nice touch. I want you to go ahead and unpack the frame. I'm not going to film the entire thing here because it'd be boring watching me open packets. But when you have that frame open, you'll see this piece here, which is the kind of key piece for getting everything tight and cinched down. But I want you to grab this. I want you to grab this piece, which is the bottom plate, and what we're going to do is put this C-lock mechanism over the top of that plate there, like this, and then we're going to grab our stack screw pack, which contains a number of parts. Just for this bit, you just need the screws out of this, which are these long ones right here. Normally I would fit this over those screws to make them M3 for some of the other stacks that I use, but for this Flywoo stack you don't need it, as the Goku mini stack takes an M2 screw anyway, so you don't actually need it. I didn't realize this at the time, so I actually put these on. So you might see this in a few frames, but you don't need that extra plastic piece. Just put the screws through the frame, as I'm kind of doing now. I'm going to speed this up a little bit so you're not just watching me stick screws in here. But once you've got all 4 of those in, you want to just take your screwdriver. I'm using this with an electric screwdriver because this takes so long typically. I'll speed this bit up as well for you. And once you get all those screws tightened down, you should end up with something that looks a little bit like this. So now we're going to get to work on the rest of the bottom plate. There is a screw pack that says bottom plate screw pack, and you want to take the standoffs as well. So I'm just going to take these out of the pack, and then we'll just have these ready for use in just a second. We're going to take one of the arms, and I'll just show you how this kind of locks in to that C-locking mechanism just there. And then what we want to do is kind of sandwich this between the other part of the bottom plate. It only kind of goes one way, you'll see it pretty easily. Just make sure you have the countersunk screw holes facing outwards like this, and what happens is as you start to screw this down, the arms kind of lock into place. They're held in with one screw, but because of the way the frame is designed, it is very tight, very rigid. But we'll come back to the arms in just a second. I want you to kind of line up the bottom plate with what you've just put together in that mid plate section as well. You'll see that all of the holes now line up with each of these screws. So I want you to go and grab one of the smaller screws that you see here. There's like short ones and long ones. The smaller ones go into the kind of middle section of the bottom plate here. We're just going to screw that in using a 2mm hex driver. Now what you want to do at this stage is not tighten that right down, because you still need to fit the arms into place. So we're going to tighten up all of those screws, all 4 of them that go into the middle here. Just don't tighten them up too much, because we've got to slide the arms into place here. If you have done them up too tight, no problem, just undo those screws a little bit until the arms actually slide into place here and here. I like to do 2 of these arms at the same time, because there's a lot less tightening and loosening of the screws to make everything kind of fit in there. Next, we're going to grab one of these standoffs, and they go into this place here with the arm. It's the shorter, fatter standoff and the kind of longer screw from that pack as well. And we're just going to put the screw through the bottom here. This will kind of go through the arm as well. Just jiggle that around a little bit and it kind of goes in. So we're just going to bring that screw all the way through to the other side. And we're going to do the same with the other arm screw at the same time before we kind of tighten all of this down. So just pull that through a little bit. And what you'll end up with is something like this. And you're going to take that standoff and just screw that onto the top of the screw. You're going to take another one of those standoffs and do the same on the other side, and you should end up with something that looks like this. And now we're going to do exactly the same for the rear arms using the other holes here. So we're just going to slide the arms into, we're going to slide that in the right way, and we're just going to put both of those arms in as we did for the front. And once the screws are in place, you're going to also add the standoffs, and you should end up with something that looks like this. Now, just as a reminder, I put the plastic on those stat screws. You don't need to do that because I had to remove those afterwards when I realized this Goku Stack was an M2 screw anyway. If we look at the standoffs we have left, there are 2 thin ones, and one is a little bit taller than the other. Now, the tall one is going to go on the front of the frame, and I'll show you that here. So we're going to take one of the small screws and we're going to put that through the bottom of the frame here, and we're just going to screw that standoff straight onto the screw so that fits to the frame just like that. We're going to take the other long standoff with the screw, and we're going to do the same on the other side, just like this. You don't even need to use a screwdriver for this. You can just put that on and you'll end up with something that looks like this. And then we're going to do the same on the back. So you're going to take the screws here and add that standoff just by screwing it into the back there. And we're going to take the other one and do exactly the same. When you're done, you should have something that looks like this, and that is pretty much the frame done. The only other thing I want you to add at this point is the O4 camera mount, which if you grab this pack here, we can get that out of the pack and add this to the frame now, because it mounts in a slightly different way than the previous Quadmula frames have done. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but you know, Quadmula have done extensive testing on this, so I guess this was kind of the better option of doing this. But once you pull this out of the packet, if I can get it out, you'll see that the camera mount is slightly different. It has two grooves here so you can move the camera around, but it also has this weird piece at the end. And what this does is that this kind of goes over the standoff here, and then you kind of fold over the other piece like this. And at the bottom there's like a groove in the frame that you kind of fit this piece into. You might just need to jiggle this about a little bit. We're just going to push that down a little bit because there's a groove in the bottom of the frame that the rest of this mount kind of just pops into like this, and that is pretty solid now. What we're going to do is put the second one on the other side too. And then when you've got all of that in place, you'll get something that looks like this. Now what we want to do is start to mount the O4 Pro air unit in here, and in the back of the Quadmula frame you can see that we have two mounting options here, which is great. So if we just grab the O4 Pro, so on the Pro you can see that there are two different types of mounts here. I'm guessing you could mount using the screws that hold together the O4 Pro to make it fit kind of this way up. I don't want to do that with this, so I'm going to mount it upside down using the 20x20 mount on the back, because then at least I've got the camera cable and the antenna much more accessible if I need to replace any of those. So I want you to grab your 1.5mm hex driver and unscrew all of the screws from the O4 camera here. And once you have the screws out, we're just going to fit the camera into the camera mount just here in the front of the frame. Don't worry about getting this perfect at the moment, we will kind of adjust this in a second, but you want to grab the little pack of screws. You get these kind of little spacers with a set of screws that you're going to use to bolt the camera in. If you used the Quadmula frame before, you'll have seen these spacers, as they use these for some of their TPU mounts where you have to kind of screw something in because it allows you to spread the load of the screw onto a much bigger surface area so it doesn't tear through the TPU. The spacers just kind of clip into place on either side here. And once those are in, you want to grab these screws. Now these are countersunk screws, which is why you want to use the ones that you get in the Quadmula pack, and they're specifically designed lengthwise to fit the camera perfectly. So don't use the screws that came with the camera, use the ones that come with the Quadmula frame, and you're just going to kind of screw these into either side. Once you've screwed all of that in, it should look something like this. Now we're going to take the O4 air unit and we're going to mount this to the frame. And in order to do that, the screws that we took out the O4 camera a minute ago, we're going to actually use these on the bottom of the air unit because these fit absolutely perfectly, and they also fit with the thickness of the frame. So grab your screwdriver, we're going to bolt this through the frame, and we're going to use the 20x20 mount, the kind of center mounts. So let's put all of those in. Just a quick note, when you're screwing this in, if you are using an electric screwdriver, I tend to do this manually at this point because I don't want to damage the air unit mounts in any way, and it's kind of the most expensive part of the quad, but you should end up with something that looks like this at the end. And one of the things about the O4 Pro is that the camera cable is quite long, so it's a bit difficult to get it kind of out of the way. Right now, I'm not so worried about that. I'm just going to kind of move it to where I need it, and then I'm going to do a dry fit of all of the components of of this anyway. Next, we need to add the O4 antennas to the frame, and to do this, Quadmula have supplied a TPU mount that is pretty interesting in design. We'll get to that in just a second. One of the things that we'll have to do though is take the antennas off, and so in order to do that we need to basically remove the 4 screws from the O4 air unit. Now please be very careful when you do this. That top plate is, or the bottom plate in fact, is attached to the air unit, so you don't want to like whip that off. You just kind of want to pull it off gently and set it to the side. I'm not sure if you can see that on the video there, but there's like a ribbon cable that's attached to that plate. But what we want this open for right now is to remove these 2 antennae. So in order to do that, you need to grab your tweezers and very, very carefully, you want to kind of separate those wires out. You want to kind of get the tweezers just underneath there and pull it straight up. What you don't want to do is pull off the UFL pad that's underneath there, because you can't really fix that afterwards. So this takes a little bit of wiggling and everything else as well, but eventually it will kind of come off, and we're just going to do the same for the second one as well. And once you have that off, you want to grab this piece here, which is the TPU part for the antenna. And within this, it's like a really cool design. You can pull out these little pieces which kind of help lock things into place. What you want to do is place the wire of the antenna into that piece and then slide it into the mount like this. What you don't want to do is basically push the antenna straight in, because you won't be able to push it in far enough. So push that in afterwards, and then we're going to do just push that in a little bit more, just so it's sitting correctly. And then we are going to do the same on the other side. So we'll just take this little TPU piece, put the wire into there as we did for the last one. We're going to place that back into the mount before pushing the antenna in. Just slide that up this way, and then we're just going to push that through, and then once that's back into the mount, we're going to then push the plastic of the antenna through. This is a little bit tight, it's very locked in there, which is great because it's not going to come out while you're flying, but it does take a little bit of effort. And then you should, it's a little bit long, let's just push that in just a little bit more. That's kind of there, so you should end up with something that looks like this. And now we need to put the antenna back on. Now I find it easier to remove this standoff from the frame at this point, because on the O4 the antenna connectors are slightly over to one side. So just remove that, it makes things a whole lot easier. I struggled with this for a little bit before realizing this would be much easier. You just kind of put them back on and press down firmly. You'll hear them click into place to know that they're back on correctly. We'll just try and put this one on as well. Yep, perfect. And then all you're going to do is take the screws and then put the case back together for the O4 air unit. Just going to fast forward through this so you don't have to sit there waiting for it. And then we're going to add that standoff back to where we removed it before. You can hand screw this in, you don't need a screwdriver to do that. Perfect. And then a little bit later on, we will put that antenna mount onto those standoffs right here like this. It fits perfectly. We're not going to do that right now though, because we have another antenna that we need to connect a little bit later on. So for now, I'm just going to leave this to one side and we'll come back to that later. So now we're just going to grab the stack and open up the box. And I'll just put this over to one side. We're going to grab the flight controller first, which is this piece here. And what we're going to do with the stack is we're actually going to dry fit it. So by dry fitting, I mean we're just going to see that everything fits, and we want to make sure that the orientation is right. So right now I'm just going to check that there is enough clearance on the bottom for the stack. And then I think we're going to put it this way around because I want the power lead to come out the back. So with that, we are just going to open up the rest of this box, because within here there will be fixtures, the capacitor that comes with the stack. We even get some connectors as well for this one, because there's a lot of connectors that Flywoo supply with this, which we will come back to a little bit later on. But we want to basically look at the stack pack. Well, I put it and don't know it, but we want to open this up, and then within here, you know, you're going to get the capacitor. We'll just move that to one side for the moment because we'll need that in a second. But we'll also get a number of kind of bolts and spacers and things. So I'm just going to pour these out. So we don't actually need all of these pieces. We don't need the some of the spares like this gummy here, or the bolts that screw the stack down, because the Quadmula frame comes with some of those, which we'll get to a little bit later on. What we are actually looking for are these spacers right here, because we want some of these to kind of go on the stack. So you want the flat ones right now. We're going to place these over the stack screws, and this will ensure that we isolate the stack from the frame itself, and it kind of raises up the stack just a little bit as well to give us a little bit of space underneath. So now that you've done that, I want you to take your flight controller, and with these battery pads, I want you to face that towards the air unit, just so that we have the power lead coming out the back. You want to fix this onto the stack screws, and once you kind of line it up correctly, it should just slide straight down into place. One of the things that you might have to do is take a pair of tweezers and just take the camera wire out the way. The O4 Pro has a very long camera wire which kind of gets in the way a lot, so just make sure that it's not blocking that ESC from sitting correctly. Then you want to take the other spacers from that pack, add these to the top here, just before you put in the flight controller. And what you want to do is just line that up again. We're just going to see how this all fits into place, and that looks pretty good. One of the things that Quadmula do is that they also supply you with a capacitor and a capacitor mount with some wires in case you need it. Now this stack actually comes with its own capacitor, which is a little bit larger, so I'm going to actually use this one here, and it's going to be a bit of a pain to fit this in. Capacitors sometimes are, especially when they're large like this one. This one is a 35 volt 470 farad capacitor, which is quite large, but I would rather use something like this for this build than the small one that came with the frame. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take the flight controller back off, because I just want to make sure that I'm putting this the right way around so that the wires go in the direction that I want them. I'm just going to put these spacers back onto the ESC because they got stuck to the flight controller gummies. And you're going to want to take out the flight controller diagram from the box here, which shows you all of the wiring and what each of these ports does. Now, I'm looking at this, and that is the DJI port, which I want to face back here for the DJI Air unit, so it's not going over the flight controller later on. And we're just going to flip that back over and seat it back into place on top of the stack here. What I want to do now is just make sure that the top plate fits on there. Nothing is touching the top from the flight controller. Just make sure I've got that on the right way around, and then I'll do a quick check just to make sure that there is space. You don't want the carbon frame to be touching anything on the stack, because it will short out whatever it is that's touching it. One of the things I've realized here is that the camera is not quite seated properly in the frame, so I just want to try and get that camera mount put in, because otherwise the frame won't actually close properly. So I'm just going to take a pair of tweezers and just shift that into place, and then it should just kind of click in like that, and then we can try putting this top plate back on again. Perfect. Yep, now that sits much better. Just taking a look at that frame, and we do have some clearance there, so that is good news, because it means that we are good to go with the spacers that I've used within the stack now. You can see here that there is a little bit of a gap. I don't know if you can see that on camera or not, but that is your dry fit complete. We know that that fits. Now we can start working on connecting up all of the areas of the stack. So you want to get your wiring diagram back out so that we can take a look at where we're going to connect the receiver. So I'm just going to pull this back out of the frame for a second. So looking at the wiring diagram, it looks like we can use this port over here on the right hand side, and we're going to connect the receiver up using one of the connectors that you get with this pack as well. You just kind of want one of those connectors that fits that port. It should have 4 wires on it, so we're going to use this one. Just make sure that that fits in, and yeah, we can connect the other side of that to the receiver. We're going to have to solder that on, but we'll go through that in just a second. At this point, you probably want to take out the pigtail for the power, and also this cable which connects the flight controller to the ESC. This cable will only fit one of the ports on the FC, but if in doubt you can check the wiring diagram, but it is the opposite side to where the DJI port is. And just get this around the right way. That should just clip into place like so. And then on the actual frame itself, the flight controller, it should just clip onto the front of that in there as we start to fit all of this up. This other cable is for the DJI O4 air unit, and that will clip onto the underside of this just here. Now this is a really important step to get in the habit of. You want to take the DJI O4 instruction manual, because there's a wiring diagram here, and we're just going to check the pinout of the DJI O4 in relation to the flight controller. Now I know that this flight controller is a plug and play solution, as are many of them, but I just always double check this because sometimes they change something and you're not sure of. So I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So grab your wiring diagram. We're just going to check that each of these actually aligns with what's said in that third column on here. So power goes to power, ground goes to ground, RX goes to TX, and so on and so forth, which they do right here. So we are pretty much good to go. So now what you want to do is grab that DJI wire, and then we're going to plug this into the O4, because we want to just check that all of the wires are sitting correctly. Sometimes I've plugged these in and realized it was upside down, so I had to repin it anyway. So we're going to plug that in like this, and we're just going to check the colors against, take this out of the way, we're going to check the colors of each of those wires against that wiring diagram, just to make sure that they are sitting in the right place, and these ones are, so it actually is plug and play. We can now remove this, and we're just going to set this to one side for the moment, because we want to see how the power pigtail actually fits within this as well. So this is going to have to go over the O4 air unit like this, and it looks like there's enough length. Also, while you're here, just make sure that you've got the positive and negative the kind of right way around, that it's going to fit on the flight controller in the right way. One thing I want to show you is on the Siren F35 that I built, it has this way of putting the pigtail through the bottom of the frame, which is like really nice, and the F3 has the same thing as well. With this one, you can't actually do that. I've just knocked all the spacers off of the ESC. We'll put those back on in just a second, but you can't actually do that through here. There's not enough space, which is a bit of a shame, but we just put the pigtail over the top of the O4 air unit. There's enough space in there. The O4 air unit is actually a bit smaller than the O3 was, so there's plenty of room there now in the back of the frame because of that. So now we're going to solder on the pigtail to the flight controller. So we're going to take that flight controller back off like that, put it down here. And then from the Goku box, I'm going to take out the capacitor that came with the stack. And we're going to figure out a way of putting that onto here and also it fitting into the frame. So let's take a look at how that looks. Quite important is that you get the negative side here onto the negative terminal on this side as well. The negative side has always got this kind of different stripe color on there. So now that we've taken a look at that, you want to get yourself a pair of snips because we need to take the connectors down a little bit so it all fits into place nicely. It would be really tempting to just snip these, but we're actually not going to do that. We're going to put this back into the frame just to make sure that it all fits in nicely. So we're just going to seat the ESC back into the frame if we can. Yep, there we go. And then we're just going to add this capacitor and just see what this looks like. Now, normally I would seat the capacitor kind of up here over the O4 air unit like this. The O4 has a weird offset set of cabling, so that doesn't quite work. And also on the F3 and F35, the capacitor sits up here and kind of pokes through the frame, so it gives you a bit more space. On the old F25, it doesn't actually fit there, so I've actually had to put the capacitor underneath the AIO that I was using in that build. I can't do that with this one, so I need to figure out a way of fitting it somewhere around here, but I don't think that the top plate is gonna fit the capacitor on the top here like this. So let's take a look just in case. I'm going to put the capacitor there and then see where that lies with the top plate. And you can see there that the capacitor doesn't quite fit in that hole, so the top plate is not going to go down as we need it to kind of fix the quad together. So we're going to have to rethink about where we're going to put this capacitor. And after a little bit of time trying to figure out where to put this, I've come up with a solution. So we're actually going to bend these contacts quite far up this way, like so. And I'm just going to make sure that that can bend without breaking it. So we're going to now put this into the ESC, and there's a couple of holes in the ESC, so you can like slide these two contacts through, and we can check the fit in the frame before we snip anything or solder anything. So now that that's in there, we can slide. Okay, let's just bend that a little bit more. Just be very careful when you're bending this, you don't want to break it off. So we're going to slide the ESC back onto the stack screws, and that kind of pushes up. We want that to kind of sit vertical right there, and that looks like it's going to fit perfectly. It's kind of below the standoff there, so it should clear the frame nicely. So we want to get the cap attached to the ESC now. And in order to do this, we just want to make sure that we have kind of isolated the bottom of this as well from the frame, because we don't want that shorting out on the frame. So now what I'm going to do is pick up a piece of shrink wrap, and we're going to just make sure that that fits this capacitor, which it does pretty nicely. Yep, and then we can cover that a little bit. So see how much we're going to need. I'm going to maybe just give it a little bit of extra, and I'm just going to cut this here. You should really do this with a pair of scissors, but I've got a pair of snips with me right now, so that's what I'm using. And that cut is actually horrendous, but you know, we'll tidy that up off camera. I'm going to get a couple of pieces of heat shrink that are a bit smaller because I want to cover the contacts of the capacitor in this as well to kind of isolate this from the frame. So I'm just going to see if that fits over, which it does. So that's about the right size. I probably need about that much. I'm going to check that on the other side there. So I still need to be able to get that contact through the ESC to solder it, but I do want to just make sure that I've got some of this on the bottom of that contact so it doesn't short out against the frame. And I'm just going to snip that one here too. Okay, perfect. Okay, so now I'm going to slide these two pieces of heat shrink over these contacts, and I want to push that around all the way to the end as far as it will go, because it's more likely the bottom of this is going to touch the carbon frame. So I just want to make sure that that goes all the way around there and helps us isolate that. So we're just going to push that a little bit around there, so it should look something like this. Now I don't have a spare plug to plug in my heat gun right now, so I'm going to pretend that I've just heated this up. I'm going to take it off camera and we're going to get it done. And as if by magic, it should look something like this once you are done heating that up. And now you can go ahead, take the ESC and poke this back through the two connectors here, just to check that that all fits perfectly, like so. And what we can see now is we can actually see where it is that we need to snip the connectors right here, because they're quite long, but we can just take a look at that and snip those as needed. So we're going to do that right now. We're going to leave a little bit of it coming through, but just a very small amount, because we still want it to go through the hole. We just don't want it to be as long as this. So take your snips and you're just going to cut this one here. Just be very careful because these ping off pretty drastically. I just want to have a little bit of extra poking through, and then we're just going to snip that there. And then we're going to do the same with the other one. And as if by magic, they just completely disappear and you'll never find them again until you tread on them in a couple of months. So now that you have this all kind of measured up and put in, we just want to double check that this actually fits in the frame now. So we're just going to grab the frame back again, and then we're going to add this onto the stack screws one more time. Now this seems like a lot of checking. I always triple check this because there's nothing worse than soldering these contacts for the capacitor and the power lead and then realizing it doesn't fit, because these are the worst ones to mess around with. But let me just take the camera wire out of the way there for just a second so that we can get this to seat right down, and we'll just push that in to where it should be. Okay, and yeah, that looks like it should be good to go. So now we're ready to solder. So get your soldering iron, your solder, and I always use a piece of blue tack. I don't know why blue tack is white in Switzerland, but using this actually keeps your components kind of stuck down in one place as you're soldering, so they don't rock around all over the place. You're now going to grab some flux and you are going to spread this onto the contacts fairly liberally like this. As I say, this is no clean flux, so I don't have to clean it off afterwards. You're going to take your soldering iron. I have this set to 390 degrees, and you're going to hold this down. You want the chisel tip on there at this point,
because it takes a little while to heat up these giant pads, and then as soon as you add the solder, it should just go straight in. And then we're gonna do the same to the other side. The negative one takes a little bit more heat to get going, so we're just gonna keep adding solder onto this, and then that should be done. So you should have something that looks, it's a little bit hot, you should have something that looks a little bit like this, and the soldering pads are now prepared for the XT30 that we're going to solder onto there next. So we're just going to put that down. We're going to grab our XT30, which we just want to make sure that we are going to put this in the right place. So what I want to do is I want to get the frame again, and I'm going to fit this to the frame just to make sure that the capacitor still fits, but I'm also checking now for the XT30, because as I said, the O4 Pro has this weird offset plug, so I think the XT30 is going to have to kind of bend around probably the standoff and the capacitor in some way. So we're going to take that in here like this, and then we're just going to see how that fits. Just make sure you have the positive and negative the right way around. It looks like I'm going to have to go probably in here to the side. I think actually it's probably better to go around the capacitor in that way, and then have the lead come out like this. So that's got good length, so it should be okay. So one thing I do want to do at this point, you can see that I've not got any solder on the bottom of this, and I just want to solder that in so that there's no way that the capacitor can come out as I'm soldering the XT30 on the top half of that. So we're just going to take our blue tack or white tack again, get our soldering iron ready, get some solder. In fact, let's put some flux on this as well. Never have too much flux. And then we are just gonna add some solder to the pads where the capacitor is going through from the bottom. And just on this side as well. Negative is always a little bit more difficult to heat up. So let's just grab a bit more solder. We should be good to go. So now we want to turn this back over, because we're going to put the XT30 onto the flight controller. So grab the XT30. You want to make sure that you are soldering the red to the positive and the black to the negative. Just a little bit closer up. If yours doesn't have a red lead on here, there is a positive and a negative symbol on there. I don't know if you can see that on the camera, but we just want to make sure that we put this on the right way, otherwise quad go boom boom when we plug it in. So we're going to start by just making sure that we know exactly where we're going to put this. Just make sure there's enough space. Let's stick that down a little bit more. I'm just going to slightly bend these wires the other way, because I don't know why they always package them with them bent not the way that it's actually going to fit a quad, but I'm going to have those wires come in. I'm going to bend the ends just a little bit, because we want to make sure that we can fit that in, as they're going to be slightly offset. One of the things you'll notice is that these wires come pre-tinned, but I'm still going to do this anyway, because I don't know what they've tinned it with. I don't know what solder they've used. So we're going to take the XT30 and we're going to prep it again. We're going to add some flux to this, add some solder, and then just make sure that we can get like a really good connection. So get your flux out again, just cover the ends of this on with as much flux as you can. And then you're going to take your soldering iron, and what we're going to do is we're actually going to heat up the wire from the back with your soldering iron, and then we're going to apply the solder to the front of the wire, and the wire will just suck it up as soon as it's heated. And it doesn't require a lot, just enough to make sure that that wire looks like it's covered in solder. And we're just going to do the same to the other one as well. Okay, so that is your XT30 prepared. We're just going to stick the ESC back down onto the blue tack, and then we're just going to fit these around the capacitor, I think. Or should it go around this way? Actually, yeah, maybe we can do it that way. What I'm going to do is I'm going to solder the positive one on first, because then that gives us a little bit more room to do that. So I'm just going to bend the ends very slightly on this, and they'll stay kind of bent, but this will make it a little bit easier to solder that into place than if you're trying to put a straight wire in there. So as you can see there, it's now at like a really good angle to solder that on. So we're going to take out tweezers, because you don't want to be holding that wire as you do this. We're going to take the soldering iron, just stick that down a little bit better, and then we're going to put the wire on top of the pad that is pre-tinned, and then we're just going to heat up the top of that wire, and it will just melt nicely straight onto that pad, and that is pretty much perfect. And afterwards, I always like to add just a little bit of extra solder. This is just a habit I've kind of gotten into, so I'm just going to add a little bit more on top there just to make sure that connection won't come off. If you've seen previous videos of mine, you've seen when one of those snaps off as I crash, so I'm a little bit paranoid about that now, so I just add a bit of extra solder. We're going to grab the other wire and do the same. So again, you're going to put the wire on top of the pad, and then just apply heat until that goes onto there. The negative is always much worse, so just kind of looking at that, I'm not entirely happy with how that's connected. So I'm just going to touch the soldering iron on there again, just to heat it up, just to make sure that that connection is completely secure. And yeah, that should probably do it. Maybe a little more. Just hold that for a second, and yep, we should be good. So let me show you the. That looks good. Ooh. And okay, let me grab this, and then I can show you. It's a little bit hot, so I'm just going to use the tweezers to bring this up to the camera so you can see. But that is what you should get, something similar to this. Next on the flight controller is that we want to actually start to solder. We actually want to prepare the motor wire pads here and here on the sides. We're not going to solder the motors on yet. We will do that when it's kind of situated in the frame. But we just want to make sure that we've got the pads ready to go. So again, you're going to add some flux to those pads. Take your soldering iron. We're still using the chisel tip on this, the wide tip. And we're just going to go onto each of these pads. We're going to add a blob of solder on all 6 on this side. A little bit more solder there. we're just going to turn this round and we're going to do exactly the same on the other side. So again, just add some flux, stay it down a little bit more, add flux to all 6 of those motor pads. And then we're just going to heat this up and then add some solder onto each one of these as well. I haven't sped this up on purpose. I'm doing this in real time so you can see just how long it takes to actually do this soldering. You don't want to hold that soldering iron onto the pad for too long. You might damage something. So it's a really quick job. As I said, I work at 390 degrees. I know people that work at 420, but you don't need a lot of time at that temperature in order to heat those pads up. So now that that is done, we have the flight controller prepared for the motors, and let's just pick this up with the tweezers again, and it should look something like this. Try and get that into focus. Okay, so let's put the ESC over to the side for just a second and look at the flight controller. Now we want to get this prepared for the build, but unlike most other flight controllers, you do not need to solder anything to this. You can if you want, but it has plugs for pretty much everything. So for the DJI unit, we're going to be using this plug here, and then for the receiver, I'm not going to have to even solder that onto the flight controller because we have this plug here, which we want to start to repair the wires for. Just soldering straight onto the receiver itself. But for the flight controller, we don't need to actually solder anything to this, which makes this build extremely easy. So I am just going to prepare these wires so that we can get this soldered directly to the receiver. So at this point, I'm actually going to unplug my soldering iron because I want to change the tip that I have on here, and on the TS80 that I have here, it's really easy. It's got this kind of just clean that up just before I take this off. You basically slide this mechanism. I'm going to use a pair of tweezers because it's still going to be hot, and then you can just remove this tip like that, and then you can grab the other tip, which is much narrower, better for tiny soldering jobs. As you can see there, it's quite a fine point, so these wires are quite small, so I want to use something a little bit smaller. Okay, so now you're going to grab your receiver, which is in this pack here, and in this pack you'll have the receiver and antenna. I'm just going to put the instructions back. You'll also get this wire here, which we're not going to use because we've already got one from the flight controller plugged in, and we're just going to take out this piece of heat shrink as well, which is going to help us isolate the receiver from touching any of the other components. One thing I like about Radiomaster is that they do give you 2 of those just in case something happens to the first one. So I'm just going to take the receiver out here, and you'll see that this says LBT on the back on this sticker, which is for Europe. If you have a US one, it might say something else on there, but I'm just going to pull this off. Just get rid of that for a second. So what we need to do is basically solder the wires in order onto these little pads here on the receiver. So I'm going to prepare the wires. I'm just going to twist these up, one to kind of shorten this a little bit and tidy it up. And then I'm just going to keep them splayed out like this, which is going to let me kind of tin these wires and prepare them for attaching to the receiver. So So grab your soldering iron, similar to how we did this before, and you are going to grab the solder and just touch the wire at the back, add some solder there. These are fairly small wires. I'm using quite a high temperature, so it doesn't need a lot of heat. It will just absorb that very, very quickly. Just like, need a little bit more, there you go. Just like that. Once those wires are tinned, we're going to grab our receiver. Now we need to check the pinout of this as well, so that we know which wire goes to which pad on the receiver. And so looking at the port that I'm looking at, it looks like it's ground, RX, TX, and then the 4.5 volt pad. But now if I look at the wiring, I just want to check that that's in the same order. However, the wiring looks like it is black, then red, then yellow, then white. And that's not necessarily an issue because you can solder those wires to wherever you like. You don't have to use these colors. However, if you come back to the quad and you haven't been doing this consistently and you don't remember what you soldered to what, it makes it a little bit more complex to repair. So I tend to try and keep at least ground and live the same colors, so always red and black. And so I want to make the RX the white wire and keep the TX as yellow, and have the red wire pointing to the 4.5 volt pad. So after removing the connector, what I need to do is kind of just repin this back out so that those wires now correspond with the diagram. So I'm just going to separate these wires out so it's a little bit easier to see what I'm doing here. And once I've kind of unraveled these, now what I want to do is take the red and the white wire, and I'm just going to switch these around. And in order to do that, you want to get your tweezers, and you'll see like there's a little flap on the JST connector, and you kind of want to just pry that up a little bit. You don't need a lot of force or anything. You just kind of pry that up a little bit, and then you start to be able to pull out the wire. If I can get it, it's a little bit fiddly, but that comes out fairly easily. Just like that. And you can see, just remember which way round that wire goes. There's a kind of locking bit which you want to kind of point down on there. And then we're going to do the same with the red wire too. So I'm just going to open that little locking flap up a little bit, and then we're just going to pull slightly on that red wire. Just one more time, and that comes out too. So you just want to switch these two wires over. You don't need your tweezers to put these back in. You just kind of slide it straight into that slot. Just make sure that it's the right way round. And then as you kind of push it in, it should just lock into place. You'll kind of feel it kind of latch in there, and then just give it a little tug and it should be in there. Same thing with the white wire, just make sure it's the right way around, and then slot that into the other hole next to the black ground wire now. And then push that into place, and you should be able to pull on those and it will stay in place. And now you have exactly what we have in that diagram. So when you connect it up to there, that will correspond with exactly what's on the wiring diagram in terms of the color. Okay, so now you want to take the receiver with the antenna attached. I'm going to get my white blue tack out again, and we're just going to stick this down on here a little bit. Just make sure you don't stick the antenna connector on there. And then we're going to take our soldering iron. In fact, before we take our soldering iron, we're going to flux. Just make sure that you get some flux on some of these connectors, and we're going to prepare the RX for soldering. So we're just going to tin the pads one by one on here. So we're just going to grab more solder here. We're just going to heat up that pad, just add some solder. And pad number 2. A bit more solder. Just going to add that in there. I like to angle the solder a little bit, makes it a little bit easier. And I'm just going to do that last one as well. And you now have your receiver prepared, and it should look like this. Okay, so we're now ready to solder the wires onto the receiver, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick a diagram up here so you can see what I'm doing, but I'm going to solder the black onto the minus pad on the receiver right here. So I'm just going to grab a set of tweezers and my soldering iron, and you're going to put the wire just on top of that pad, put the soldering iron on there just a little bit, and it will solder onto it just like that. Next we're going to take the red wire and we're going to solder that to the 5-volt pad, which is right here. I'm just going to stick that down a little bit. It's moving around a little bit, which is not what it's there for. So I'll just pick that wire up again and then just put it on top of the pad, add some heat, and that is ready to go. We're going to take the white wire now. Get it? And we're just going to add that to the top of the pad. I'm just going to bend that slightly. Now, if you look carefully at the diagram, you'll see that the white wire comes from the RX, but that goes into the TX of the receiver, and the yellow wire comes from the TX of the flight controller and goes into the RX of the receiver. That's correct, and that's how it should be. Don't get those two things mixed up. And I'm just going to apply a little bit more heat on there, just to make sure that's in properly. Doesn't require a lot of heat, and that should be done, and you'll end up with something that looks like this, hopefully. And so congratulations, you now have your receiver prepped and ready to connect back into the flight controller, and you're almost done with the soldering, so keep with it. There isn't much left to do in terms of like soldering itself. We just have to start bolting things back together. So just grab your frame and a motor. I'm gonna put one of the motors onto the frame, and then I'll fast forward through the video so that you can you don't have to watch me bolt all 4 motors on. Motors typically come with the fixings and a few spares as well. We don't need the bolts for fixing this motor to the frame because Quadmula supply ones that actually fit the frame perfectly, and that looks pretty cool in red. I want you to get the motor screw pack that comes with the Quadmula frame. Now, these screws are specifically designed for the size of those frame arms, like the thickness of it, and they're pretty good quality. A lot of the hardware that comes with Quadmula frames is really good, so I just want you to take those out of the pack. We need 4 of those for this motor, and basically what I do is with my 1.5mm hex driver, I like to poke this through the frame first. I would use the bottom holes first because they're not slots, and then just figure out where the hole is on there and slightly turn this just to make sure that it kind of locks into place. And then we're going to do the same for all 4 of these bolts. I'm just going to speed this up a little bit so you're not watching me just screw things in. If you want, you can use some Loctite to keep these kind of from falling out. I'm not going to do that for this build right now. And I'm just going to tighten those up slightly. You don't want to over tighten them, but you should end up with something that looks like this, and the wire kind of goes down the arm like this. So I'm going to speed up this next bit, but what you want to do is take each of the motors and do exactly the same so that you've got all 4 motors into place and ready to go. And you should end up with something that looks like this at this point. And don't worry too much about how long those wires are. We are going to sort that all out in the next part. So at this point, I just want to wrap that camera cable around those stack screws, and then I'm just going to re-add those little spacers back onto the screws themselves, because next I'm going to put the flight controller back into the frame as we're going to start to prep the soldering of the motors to the flight controller. So just quickly, you want to take the flight controller and unplug this. You want to put this into the ESC first before you put this into the frame and solder everything up. There's nothing worse than soldering everything up and then realizing that that's not plugged in, but this allows the flight controller and the ESC to talk to each other. It's just easier to do this now than it is if you were to do it a little bit later on. We're just going to put the flight controller back into the frame, and once we kind of put that in there, I just want to also check that the camera cable for the O4, which is kind of going underneath that, isn't stopping that from seating correctly. And yeah, you can see that there's a little bit of camera cable kind of in there, so just take that out and push it down a little bit. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. One thing that I do want to do is just the top of that capacitor. I just want to kind of isolate that a little bit. So I'm going to use a little bit of this electrical tape, if I can get it open. And I'm just going to take a small piece of this tape and I'm just going to put it on top of that capacitor, just to make sure there's no way that anything can short out. I'm pretty sure that that isn't the case if the top of the capacitor touches the frame, but I'm just paranoid about it and want to isolate it anyway. So once that's in, it should look like this. Next, we're going to take the wires, so you can undo the wires, and we're going to use these pads on the ESC to solder the wires to. Now, the wires always come extremely long. We don't need that much length on these wires, so what we're going to do is I'm just going to feed this behind the camera and in between the camera and the standoff here. Fiddly, and I'm just pulling each of these wires through one by one because there's not a lot of space there because of that O4 air unit. The O4 camera is pretty big. Once you've done that, I'm going to grab a piece of tape and I'm going to tape up the motor wires so that they are sitting against that arm. So we're just going to grab those motor wires, make sure that they're sitting flush against the arm there, and then we're gonna grab this tape and put it around the arm like that. Keeps things a little bit neat. And yeah, that looks good. That stops the wires from moving around as well as you're trying to solder them into place too. So now we're going to just check the length of the wire that we actually need. That wire is going around the standoff, and I want to solder it to these pads. So I'm just kind of looking right now at where I can cut the wire. Now I don't want to cut it to the exact length I think it needs, because I always cut it a little bit longer just in case. There's nothing worse than having a motor cable that's a bit too short. It it's a real pain to fix that afterwards. But once you've figured out where you want that wire to be cut, you just grab your snips and you are gonna double check it before you do it. I'm gonna put a little bit of leeway in there, and then I'm just gonna cut the wire right about there. And you're just going to cut the other wires exactly the same. Once you have the right length, you want to then, with your nail, just peel off a little bit of the insulation of that wire so that you got the end of the wire kind of exposed, and then you're just going to twist the end of that wire. We're going to do the same for the other two as well. And so you should end up with something that looks like this, with the kind of ends of those wires slightly exposed. You kind of want about as the pad that you're going to be soldering to on the ESC. It doesn't have to be completely accurate, but that's just a rule of thumb. So now we're going to start prepping the wires for soldering. So as per normal, we're going to add some flux to those wires, just so that we can get them tinned. And we're going to take the soldering iron and some solder, and as always, we're just going to put the soldering iron behind the exposed part of the wire, and then just touch the solder onto the front so that we tin those ends. When soldering wires to the flight controller, I like to bend the ends of them a little bit, because it makes it actually a little bit easier to solder these on when they're kind of bent at an angle. Once you've tinned the wire, they kind of, as you bend them, they kind of stay a little bit into place, but we're just going to make sure that those are kind of at a slight angle. And then you're going to grab your flux. You're going to flux the pads right here, just to make sure we've got a solid connection. And then with your tweezers, you're going to just bend that wire around and put it on top of the pad. Just add a little bit of heat on top of there, and then it doesn't take a lot of heat. Should be, that doesn't look so good. Hang on, I'm gonna redo that just slightly. So I just want to move that over a little bit more. Not that I'm a perfectionist, but I just want to make sure that that's a good connection. Okay, and then we're gonna take a second wire and I'm just gonna bend that round onto the pad a little bit. A bit of heat. I just need to move that a little bit. I'm not entirely happy with that one. So I'm just going to add a bit more heat and then bring that around. Okay, great. And now we just want to take the final motor wire from this one. Do the same thing again. Just bend it around a little bit. And just put that on top of the motor pad. Add a bit of heat and hold it there for a second. That was good. Okay, and that is one of the motors done, and I'll bring this closer to the camera, but it should look something like this. I'm going to time lapse the other three motors as I'm soldering on everything, so that you don't have to watch me do each one of these separately. But you want to do exactly the same thing for each of the other motors. So get those wires to the right place, prep the wires, solder the pads to the wires, and then you should end up with something that looks a little bit like this. Maybe with a better soldering job than I've done there though. So now you're going to grab the receiver and you're going to add this heat shrink over the top of it. And then we're going to use a heat gun, which I can't do on camera. So 3, 2, 1. And as if by magic, the shrink wrap is now ready to go, and this receiver is isolated. So take your flight controller, we're going to plug this back in to that port right there. to plug in, let's just twist that wire once, maybe twice, just to kind of keep that neat and tidy. And then we're going to plug that into the front of the flight controller right here. And now you can take the DJI cable from the O4 and we're going to plug it in underneath there. But what we're going to do before we do that is just twist this a little bit so that we kind of shorten that and just make it a little bit neater so that it sits within the frame. You don't want that flapping around all over the place. So after a few twists, we're just going to plug that in. Just need a little bit more. And we're just going to plug that into here, like that. And you'll feel it kind of clip in when it's ready. Yep, okay. And now we can put the flight controller back into the stack screws. And what we want to do now is grab these pieces, which you'll see in the kind of stack screw mount baggie that comes with the Quadmula frames. I really love these. I've got a load of these that I bought separately and I use them in all my builds, but you then just want to kind of twist this on with your finger. And then once that's on, we're going to do the same for the rest of these as well. We're just going to tighten those down so that they don't come off, and you'll end up with something that looks like this. So now the ELRS receiver, we want to put the antenna at the back here. So, we just want to kind of make sure that we get the wires in the place that we want them. So I'm just going to twist this as well, just to shorten it up and make it neat and tidy. And then once we're kind of ready, I think that will probably sit there on top of the O4 air unit like this. And then what we're going to do is actually put the ELRS antenna at the back here. There's kind of a little groove that's like perfect for adding that in. So I'm going to hold the antenna here and then slide through a cable tie. It is a little bit tight because of that O4 air unit. And then just pull that through. And then tie that up. Cinch it down so that it's not moving around in any way. Take your snips and then just cut the excess off of there, like that. And it should look something like this. I normally use a 3D print, but actually this keeps the weight down just by using a small cable tie. And the Radiomaster antennas are quite durable anyway. Let's take a look at the O3 antenna, because this mount now goes onto the rear standoffs like this. It's a very tight fit, that's not going anywhere once you put it on. And then this XT30 will come out the back here of the frame when we put the top plate on. Now you may notice there's a load of wires here. What I'm going to do is put another cable tie here. You will see me do this on other builds as well. I'm not going to tie this yet. What I'm going to do is put that over the frame once I put the top plate on anyway, and it will just hold everything tightly together on the top of the frame. I'm not going to do this until I've set everything up, and then I'll tighten that at the end just to make sure. But with the top plate, we're just going to make sure that all goes on correctly, and then we can start screwing in all of the screws from the top plate screw pack. And then once we've got that, there's this one piece which is I'm guessing that this is a kind of secondary bit of protection for the O3 camera, and you just want to kind of screw those in like that, and then you should end up with something like this. Now I am also going to put protection on the arms as well, and when you put these on, Sometimes they're a little bit tight, so what I like to do is kind of just warm them up with my hands a little bit. If you don't have warm hands, you can use a heat gun, just very gently, and then that just makes them a little bit more malleable, and they can go straight on. But we're just going to squeeze that top bit, and then we're going to poke that in like this, and then we're going to do the same for each of the arms. Now, I normally use a different type of TPU print that is bright yellow so that I can find it when I lose it, but I'm just going to use the one straight from the frame in this build. And then you've got a little chin mount at the front as well, so you can like squeeze that on just to protect the camera a little bit. Now, I want to do a quick check at this point with a multimeter. It's really handy if you have one of these. So I'm going to be using this setting here, which is an audio setting. You'll see the light flashing as I touch the connectors together. It also makes an audio beep, which I don't think the microphone's going to pick up. And so I'm going to plug positive into the positive and the negative into the negative of the pigtail. You're going to see the numbers jumping around a little bit. That's fine, but there's no noise, no light. Next, I want to make sure that there's continuity on the ground, so I'm going to touch the ground wire and the USB-C port, and I get a noise and some light as well. That shows me that it's working. If you have a smoke stopper like this one that I have from TBS, we're going to now plug that into power so that we don't hopefully get any magic smoke as we plug this in for the first time. If there's something wrong, we will see that straight away. But no, everything seems fine. It looks like there's no problem, so we're good to go. And now for the crucial time, I'm going to put some motor screws on here as well. I just want to weigh the quad. I haven't weighed this yet. 169, yeah, that's pretty much within spec for a sub 250 quad. Together with the battery strap. It's a pretty heavy battery strap, and I'm going to be using one of these, which is an R-Line 650 battery, and that comes into 246 grams, so that is sub 250. I wonder what it would be like with an 850. These are 4S as well, and that's 258, so a little bit too much, but there's a load of weight saving that I could do on this. Okay, so for the next bit, you're going to need a USB-C, you're going to need Betaflight configurator, and also Express LRS configurator. And we are going to go into Express LRS first. You are going to basically come down here and select Radiomaster 2.4 gigahertz, and then we need to find the RP01 receiver. I am using an older version of ELRS. You can use a newer one if you like. I know that this one works. Everything else on here you want to keep Betaflight pass through, and then add your binding phrase in here, and then you don't need to manually select the device or anything like that, but we're just going to hit flash down here at the bottom, and then that will run the build, and with any luck we should have something that is successful. This does take a little while. I have sped this part up for the video, but we have got ELRS successfully configured. So next we're going to open Betaflight, and when it connects to your quad, you should be able to move the quad around, and hopefully this diagram will be exactly the same. If you followed my instructions, you've got it configured in the right way, and it should mimic that. Now we're going to go to the ports tab over here, and this looks fairly confusing at first, but let me show you how to read this and what to do with it. So if we go back to our wiring diagram that we got with the controller, you can see here that we've used TX3 and RX3 on the DJI controller for that port. So what we're going to do is go over here and select UART3, and we're going to turn that one on. And then we're going to leave everything else in that line as it is. So we're going to come back to the diagram, and you can see that we've used RX5 and TX5. So we're going to come down to UART5, and we're actually not going to turn this one on. we keep that one turned off because this is a serial receiver, so we're going to turn on serial RX, and then nothing else needs to change, and that is your ports configured. Make sure you hit save and reboot, and then the quad will disconnect and reconnect, and that is all saved for you now. Now you're going to come over to the configuration tab, and in this one I'm actually going to add a craft name purely because I keep flying lots of different quads, so I just want to make sure I know which one I'm flying when I look back at the video afterwards. So I'm just going to add DF25 SP in there, and then I just want to make sure that I've got these set to on so that it beeps and I lose signal. And then camera angle is about 25. Arming, I want to change this to 180 degrees so I can arm even if it's not on flat ground. And then everything else looks pretty good. I don't need to change anything there. All of that looks good, so we're just going to save and reboot again. And now we're going to come over to the presets tab, and when we come in here, I'm actually going to use this Superfly preset, but if it isn't showing on your home screen, you want to come up to the search, and then you can just type in Superfly, and you want this freestyle 3 or 4 inch. There isn't a 2.5 inch version, but this works for the Quadmula 2.5 inch frame. And then we're just going to come select some of the options within here. So I'm running this with no action camera, and then I'll run this with nothing else turned on. That all looks good. I'm going to put my own rates in there, so I don't need to do that. I'm just going to hit pick, and then I'm going to agree to adding this preset, and then I'm going to save and reboot. Perfect. Now I'm going to come to PID tuning. This is what the preset has done. I'm not going to touch this right now, but what I am going to change is the rope profile settings. So I have a specific set of rates that I fly with on pretty much all my quads. So I'm going to select actual. You'll get to see the rates that I fly with here, which are pretty slow in comparison to some pilots I've seen. Basically, I'm going to come down to center sensitivity, and I'm going to set that at 150. My max rate I'm going to set at 750, and the expo is 0.8, and I'm going to do the same on pitch, but on yaw I'm going to set that max rate to 700, and everything else is the same. I don't add a throttle limit on here, and I don't add any expo to the throttle curve either, so I have a linear rate for that, and we're just going to hit save. Now I want to come to the receiver, but in order to do this next bit you're going to need your radio. I don't have mine turned on, so I'm just going to go and grab that, and then we can set up the receiver tab. When you get into the receiver tab, you might find that your quad is spinning like this. Don't worry about that, we're going to figure that out in just a second, but as you start to move the sticks around, you'll see that the sticks are not necessarily tracking with what the movement should be doing, and we'll change that in just a second. So what you need to do is just come down to here where it says channel map, and we're going to change this from AETR to TAER, and then we're going to come down here, hit save, and hopefully that should be now mapping against everything that you're doing with the sticks. If it isn't, then keep playing around with those letters. They correspond to each of those axes. But typically this will solve it if you're flying it in mode 2. Okay, so now you're going to come over to the modes tab. You still need your radio connected, and we're going to add a range on arm, and then you're going to basically press the button that you want to use for your arm switch. And for me it's aux4, so then I'm going to slide this up to the position where that tab is. So now as I turn it off, it's no longer armed. I'm going to set up angle mode in case you guys want to use that. I rarely fly in this, but I'm going to use that on aux3, and that's going to be set to the middle switch, so that range is okay. And then horizon I'm going to set to aux3, but I'm going to set this to the 3rd position on that switch. So you can see now that as I flick the switch, it will kind of go in between each of those different modes. I'm going to come down here and I am going to add a beeper. So I'm going to add range, and then I'm going to press this button, which is aux1, and I'm going to slide that up to make sure that when I press that button now, I've got a beeper. And as I turn that on and off, you can see that switching back and forth. And then I'm going to come a bit further down, and I'm going to flip over after crash. I want to add a range. This is turtle mode. So I am going to add this switch right here, which is aux2. And then I'm going to move this range up the slider. So now I can switch between turtle mode and normal mode. Some people will use a pre-arm. I don't use it. I know lots of people do. It's probably worth it. It's a bit safer. But for this build right now, I'm not going to be using that. And just hit save. And now we're going to go to the motors tab. So in order to use the motors tab, we need to kind of disconnect the quad for a moment, because we actually have to add a battery to it. And the other thing that you want to make sure is that you do have a fan at this point, because your DJI unit will start to heat up very, very quickly when you have a battery attached to the quad. I'm just going to take the radio away because we don't need that right now. And what we're going to do is just re-plug in the quad to Betaflight, and we're also going to add a battery as well. Just make sure that you've got enough juice on the battery. So now back in Betaflight, we can come to the motors tab here. First thing I want to do is make sure that Betaflight knows which way I want the propellers to be spinning. So I'm actually going to change this to reverse because I want to make them spin outwards. This doesn't actually make the motor spin outwards. This is just telling Betaflight this is what it should expect. So you're going to save and reboot that. And then we're actually going to go into the motor setup. So at this point, I'm going to put an image of the quad on the screen so that you can actually see what I'm doing with the motors as well as I start to play around with these settings. So you're going to come over to here, which is reorder motors, and then just so you understand the risks, and you're going to hit start. Now one of the motors is going to start spinning, which is this one here. So we're going to click on that motor on the diagram. We're going to click the motor in the top right to say that that one's spinning, and then this one is spinning, so we're going to click the left and then top left. And this is just telling Betaflight which motor is which on your quad. So we're going to save that and it's going to reconnect. We go back to the motors tab, and now we're going to set the motor direction. So we click on that, accept the risks again, and you've got two options. I'm going to use the wizard for this because it's a little bit easier for you guys, and then you can start spinning up the motors as soon as you hit this. What I like to do is take one of the little screw packs from the Quadmula frame, and then I just kind of use that to figure out which way the motor's spinning. So we're going to hit the start button, the motors are going to spin, and you can see that this one, as I touch that, is spinning this way. So we want it to actually spin the other way. So I'm going to hit motor 3, and hopefully that will turn and reverse direction, and now it's spinning the way that I want it to go. Then we're going to come up to here and we're going to look at which way this is spinning, and that is spinning outwards, so that's correct. I don't need to change anything on there. We're going to come up to motor 2, that is spinning inwards, so I need to hit motor 2 here, and that will reverse the direction hopefully. Yep, perfect. And then finally I want to come to motor 1 here, and that is spinning in the correct direction. So we can stop the motors there and close that down. Everything else here seems to be fine. I don't need to adjust anything in this. I'm just going to move the quad over to that side, and then we're going to come to the right hand side of the screen, and we're going to turn that setting on, because now we're just going to turn all of the motors on at the same time and make sure that they're still spinning in the right direction. So we're going to come here to the master and just turn this up a little bit. It is a very touchy control, you don't want to go too high, but that seems to be spinning outwards. That's perfect. That one is also spinning outwards. This one is also spinning outwards. And then finally, yep, that one is also spinning outwards as well. So we have working motors. That's exactly what we want from this. So I'm just going to hit. And so now that's set up, I'm just going to disconnect quickly, because I want to unplug the quad and just let everything cool down a little bit. So we're now going to set up the on-screen display, or the OSD. So on the tab side menu, you're going to come down to OSD on the left. And in this menu, I'm going to turn off everything other than the warnings that's already kind of selected, because I have a kind of specific way that I like my OSD to look. So that's pretty much everything now aside from the warnings. One of the things I like to have is the average cell voltage, because I don't have to work this out. I just know that as soon as I get to 3.5, I need to kind of land. So I'm going to add that down there. Then I'm going to come down to craft name, which is there, and I'm going to add that to the top. Down here, and I'm going to add, where is it? Link quality. And I always put that up here on the top right. And I'm going to look at the RSSI dBm and the RSSI value, and these go up here on the top right for me. You can add on the OSD what you like. This is how I do it, and this is what I kind of keep to. I don't really add much else. Sometimes I'll add a timer, or if I have a GPS quad, then I'll put something on there. On this side, now it kind of depends on what you want to do, but you can leave that on auto and it will automatically change for you. Sometimes that doesn't work very well, but for the purposes of this video, we're just going to leave that on auto for the time being. And then everything else, I'm just going to add link quality in here as the warning, and then also RSSI dBm. For post-flight statistics, I'm going to add battery voltage and just the link quality and RSSI dBm value as well, and we're going to hit save. And that is now the OSD that's been set up. Okay, so just quickly, one of the things that can happen is that when you actually start using the quad, you don't see that OSD. So you're going to come into the presets tab, type in OSD, and then you're going to get this OSD for FPV, WTF, O3, etc. You want to select that and then map to the UART that you had used for that, which let me just show you. So in the ports tab, the UART that we have selected is UART number 3. So that's what we're going to select when we go back into the preset. And so if we can go back to presets, type in OSD, we're going to select this, I'm going to take this menu and then we're going to select UART 3. And we're going to hit pick and then save and reboot. Now what that's going to do, if you go to your OSD, you'll see that that has changed this from auto to HD. You can change it back if you want. It's not necessarily, this will kind of work in that sense now. There is one final thing that we need to do, and that is to come into the DJI Assistant app. You want the consumer series version of this app, and then you want to plug your quad, well, you want to plug the DJI O4 Pro air unit into the USB-C of your laptop. And what will happen is that this will show up here, and we need to start the activation. And then if you have a DJI account, you can just activate in that way, or you will have to put some information in. So one final thing, you want to bind your goggles to the air unit, otherwise you won't be able to see through the camera. And you want to press this little bind button here and the bind button on your goggles. You'll hear kind of a beep when it's all bound up and ready to go. And that is your Djinn F25 SP completed. So let me know in the comments if you built one of these. Drop a link to a video if you have one, and I will come and check that out. And then I'm going to go fly this thing and you'll see what happens in a future video.